Let me guess. You just bought a brand new DSLR and you took it to your kid's sports event, your daughter's dance recital, and the shots came out blurry or the shots came out really, really dark. But hey, you paid extra for the telephoto lens, so what's going on here? Well, don't feel bad. Low light photography is extremely difficult. Today, we're going to learn the secrets of low light photography. Today in this short series, you'll learn a little bit about the equipment used for low light photography, some of the camera settings, and typical low light shooting conditions and how to shoot each shot. There's three main settings on your camera that will affect exposure levels, first being the shutter speed. This is typically used to freeze action, and it controls the amount of time the sensor sees the light. There is a minimum shutter speed setting. It's typically 1 divided by the focal length time your camera's crop factor. So on a lot of digital SLRs today, the crop factor is about 1.6. So if you have a 100mm lens, your minimum shutter speed is 1/160. Anything below that, it won't be able to compensate your typical hand shake that will affect pictures and make them blurry. The next major setting on your camera is aperture, and it controls the depth of field, or how much is in focus in front of the subject or behind of it. Basically, it controls the amount of light that's allowed to enter the lens. Fast equals wide aperture equals a low number. Typically, this will be written on the lens like an f2.8 or a ratio like 1 to 2.8. Values range from lenses that you can buy are 1.4 up to about 5.6. The last major setting on your camera is called the ISO, and it's basically a amplifier for your sensor. It compensates for low light at the cost of image quality. The higher the ISO setting, the more amplification, which means you can get to lower light conditions, but you will start to see some noise at higher levels. Typical values are 100, 200, 400, all the way up to 12,800, and they can even go higher for professional body lens cameras. Let's talk about the equipment that you're going to need. A digital SLR is mandatory with that ISO 1600 or higher. 3200 is great, but the more the merrier here. If you want to catch action shots, you're going to need a camera with a low shutter lag time. Equally as important are fast lenses or wide aperture lenses. About the slowest lens you want is an f2.8. It's really going to be mandatory for low light shots. You can get lenses even faster than that. 1.4 is strongly recommended. Fast zooms tend to be very expensive, but a little later on I'll show you a great alternative with low-cost prime or fixed focal length lenses. Let's see how shutter speed and aperture work together in an example shooting condition. For the same ISO setting, as you increase the aperture, meaning you reduce the size of the hole in the lens, you're going to need to compensate by slowing down your shutter speed. Alternatively, if you wish to shoot a very fast shutter speed, you need to compensate by opening up the aperture in the lens. This is where the aperture becomes very, very critical in low light shooting. Having the ability to set higher ISO levels is also very important. If you wish to shoot an indoor activity where there's a lot of action, you need a higher shutter speed. While you may have a fast lens that can get down to 1.4 or 2, sometimes the only way to take the correct exposure is by increasing your ISO. This is just an example. Shooting conditions will vary and change how this graph looks, but this gives you an idea of the relationship between shutter speed and aperture. Whenever I shoot low light, I tend to pay most attention to the type of light that I have. First one here being constant, then I'll talk a little bit more about variable light in a few minutes. What I mean by constant light is within a room you may have different lights, like dark light in the corner or brighter light over by a window, but the light within that scene doesn't seem to change a whole lot. For these types of shots, I'll generally run my camera in AV or aperture priority mode, automatic white balance, and manual ISO. To get some initial shooting conditions, I'll generally have my lens not all the way open, but right around an f4 perhaps, and set my ISO to maybe 400 or 800. And I will let the camera tell me what the correct shutter speed is. If it's too low, meaning it doesn't fall within the parameters of the 1 over focal length rule like we saw earlier, I'll start to open up the aperture first before I adjust the ISO. I really don't want to go to high ISOs initially because of the noise that's typically introduced. However, you do have to know what your lenses will perform like in wide open conditions. Some of my lenses at f1.4, they tend to be a little soft, so I can't just open everything up and expect the pictures to come out good. Shooting an aperture priority gives me a couple of advantages. Number one, if I'm shooting something like a birthday party, I can very easily take a picture of somebody blowing out birthday candles, but turn around in a different part of the room and take a picture of somebody opening up presents. And I don't need to make any adjustments on my camera. Also, I always use point focus method. I want to be able to set exactly what subject matter is in focus. I use different settings when shooting in variable light. What I mean by variable light is imagine a rock concert where you're trying to take a picture of the lead guitarist and you've got spotlights going on or off, or pyrotechnics going on or off almost randomly. It's very difficult for the camera to quickly figure out what the correct exposure is. Here, I will set my camera to full manual mode. Sometimes I'll use manual white balance, and always manual ISO. It's a really delicate balance between aperture, shutter, and then which ISO setting to choose. I'll generally try to get a lower aperture than the 1 over focal length rule, and get the lowest ISO I can, but I will always have to reduce the aperture, increase the shutter, and then balance out with a higher ISO setting to get the correct exposure. For determining if you have a correct exposure, your natural tendency will be to look at the little preview on the back of the camera. It's not a very effective way of using it. If your camera has a histogram built into it, that's the most effective way to see if you have a good constant amount of light across the full spectrum of your image. Check your owner's manual to see how to turn on your histogram setting. As you can imagine, shooting in manual mode takes lots of experience and understanding. You're constantly having to balance aperture, shutter, and determining the correct ISO. In situations where you have highly variable light, this is really your best alternative. Just keep in mind that if you wish to take a picture of something else, and even in the general area, lighting conditions may vary, and you may have to go back and reset some of your camera settings. So be patient and practice with this mode a lot before you try to take any real critical type shots. And again, I always run my camera in point focus mode. Let's revisit equipment. If you've got your camera online or at a department store, you probably got a consumer zoom lens with your camera, something like an 18 to 55 f3.5 to 5.6. Very slow lens. If your shots are blurry or dark, that's the reason why right there. You do have a couple of alternatives for faster lenses. Far to the left-hand side here, a fast prime lens means a fixed focal length lens. You can get a reasonable lens for as low as $100, or up to thousands and thousands, depending on what your budget is. 50mm 1.4, great lens in just about every manufacturer that you can imagine it to come in. 85 is another great alternative for a slight telephoto lens. If you've got lots and lots of money, fast zoom lenses and f2.8 generally going to run you $12 to $1,500 as a starting point. They can go up there, but gives you an idea that if you don't have a lot of money to spend, you can get a really good alternative in a real fast prime lens. If you've got money to burn, fast zoom lenses are a much better way to go because of the zoom qualities that they have. So how do you get started learning how to shoot low light photography? Start shooting indoors, out at dinner, or outside at night. Practice with kids, pets, and buildings. And also consider shooting in black and white, and most importantly, know your lens capabilities. Just because your lens can shoot in f1.4, it may not be very sharp wide open. Also, know where your camera starts to produce excessive noise with high ISO settings. The more you know about your equipment, the better your shots are going to be.